There are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, you know, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction, it's something that you act out, you know? That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play, is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that. They're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to. And that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean? And how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of. It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do. Not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why. But that seems to be the situation. So, we act. That acting is shaped by the world. That acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories. We model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, well, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky or Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well, without the cornerstone that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. You know, the people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or, you know, intelligent, clear-thinking, rational, scientific people. And I don't believe that for a moment, because I don't think there's any evidence for it. I think we would become so irrational so rapidly that the weirdest mysteries of Catholicism would seem positively rational by contrast. And I think that's already happening. So... Okay. So this is the idea, essentially, you know, that you have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it, he said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is, because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And that's really worth thinking about, because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, you know, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents. It's your unconscious assumptions. It's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you. And it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question. That's part of self-realization, you know. We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, well, why did you do that? You come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it. You're flailing around in the darkness, you know, you try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that, and you're just way more than you can handle. And all right, so you act things out, right? You act things out, and that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out, and you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action, and then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology and literature, and there's a tremendous amount of information in that. And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. You know, he's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time and, you know, getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain and he has this tremendous revelation sort of in the sight of God, and it illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, you know, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert, and he was continually mediating between people who were having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says, look, this is already basically what we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And like, that's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story, but obviously that happened because we have written law, right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that, right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen, you act out the body of law. And the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful, dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that. And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? Like, that's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle. And we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal. And it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. We're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstracted ideal that we've formalized as God. But that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important. So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was, never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else. Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law. Whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union, and what happened in Maoist China, and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So, just for example, very briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins. But that's not so good, because, well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space, but from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them. And you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B. And then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too. And so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names, at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive. And you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract that covers both of us if we can do it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Marduk, I'll just give you a couple of his features, but he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god, so that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out, and when he fights this deity called Tiamat. And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, T-E-H-O-M. And Tehom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic St. George story, to go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And that's the world that human beings live in. And the Mesopotamian emperor acted out Marduk. He was allowed to be emperor insofar as he was a good Marduk. And so that meant that he had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic. He could speak properly. And so that we're starting to understand there at that point the essence of leadership, right? Because what's leadership? It's the capacity to see what the hell's in front of your face and maybe in every direction, and then the capacity to use your language properly in a transformative manner and to transform chaos into order. And God only knows how long it took the Mesopotamians to figure that out, and the best they could do is dramatize it, but it's staggeringly brilliant. You know, it's by no means obvious, and this chaos is a very strange thing, and this is the chaos that God wrestled with at the beginning of time. Chaos is it's half psychological and half real. There's no other way to really describe it. The chaos is what you encounter when you're thrown into deep confusion, right? When your world falls apart, when you encounter something that blows you into pieces, when your dreams die, when you're betrayed. It's the chaos that emerges, and the chaos is everything at once, and it's too much for you. And that's for sure. And it pulls you down into the underworld. And that's where the dragons are. And all you've got at that point is your capacity to bloody well keep your eyes open and to speak as carefully and clearly as you can. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get through it that way and come out the other side. And it's taken people a very long time to figure that out. And it looks to me like the idea is erected on the platform of our ancient ancestors, maybe tens of millions of years ago, because we seem to represent that which disturbs us deeply, using the same system that we use to represent like serpentile or other carnivorous predators. And we're biological creatures, right? So when we've formulated our capacity to abstract, our strange capacity to abstract and use language, we still have all those underlying systems that were there when we were only animals. And we have to use those systems. They're part of the emotional and motivational architecture of our thinking. And part of the reason we can demonize our enemies who upset our axioms is because we perceive them as if they're carnivorous predators. We do it with the same system. And that's chaos itself, the thing that always threatens us, right? The snakes that came to the trees when we lived in them like 60 million years ago. It's the same damn systems. So the Marduk story is partly the story of using attention and language to confront those things that most threaten us. And some of those things are real world threats, but some of them are psychological threats, which are just as profound but far more abstract. But we use the same systems to represent them. It's why you freeze if you're frightened, right? You're a prey animal. You're like a rabbit. You've seen something that's going to eat you. You freeze. And that way you're paralyzed. You're turned to stone, which is what you do when you see a Medusa with a head full of snakes, right? You're turned to stone. You're paralyzed. And the reason you do that is because you're using the predator detection system to protect yourself. Your heart rate goes way up, and you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes and get your speech organized and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's staggering. When I read that story and started to understand it, just blew me away that it's such a profound idea. And we know it's true, too, because we know in psychotherapy, for example, that You're much better off to confront your fears head on than you are to wait and let them find you. And so partly what you do if you're a psychotherapist is you help people break their fears into little pieces, the things that upset them, and then to encounter them one by one and master them. And so you're teaching this process of eternal mastery over the strange and chaotic world. And that all of that makes up some of the background. We haven't even got to the first sentence of the biblical stories yet. But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need. And I hope that that will be the case. And as I said, I'll approach it as rationally as I possibly can. So, well, this is the idea to begin with, you know, is we have the unknown as such, and then we act in it like animals act. They act first. They don't think, they don't imagine, they act. And that's where we started. We started by acting. And then we started to be able to represent how we acted. And then we started to talk about how we represented how we acted. And that enabled us to tell stories, because that is what a story is. It's to tell about how you represent how you act. And so you know that, because if you read a book, what happens? You read the book and images come to mind of the people in the book behaving, right? It's one step from acting it out. You don't act it out because you can abstract. You can represent action without having to act it out. It's an amazing thing, and that's part of the development of the prefrontal cortex. It's part of the capacity for human abstract thought, is that you can pull the behavior, the representation of the behavior, away from the behavior and manipulate the representation before you enact it. That's why you think, is so that you can generate a pattern of action and test it out in a fictional world before you embody it and die because you're foolish, right? You let the representation die, not you, and that's why you think. And so that's partly what we're trying to do with these stories. What do I hope to accomplish? I hope to end this 12-lecture series knowing more than I did when I started. That's my goal, because I said that, you know, I'm not telling you what I know. I'm trying to figure things out, and this is part of the process by which I'm doing that. And so I'm doing my best to think on my feet. You know, I come prepared, but I'm trying to stay on the edge of my capacity to generate knowledge and to make this continually clearer and to get to the bottom of things. And so I'm hoping that that's what I want to accomplish. And it seems like people are interested in that. So then we're going to try to accomplish that together. And so that's the plan. And the idea is to see if there's something at the bottom of this amazing civilization that we've managed to construct that I think is in peril for a variety of reasons. And maybe if we understand it a little bit better, we won't be so prone just to throw the damn thing away, which I think would be a big mistake. And to throw it away because of resentment and hatred and bitterness and historical ignorance and jealousy and the desire for destruction and all of that. It's like, I don't want to go there. It's a bad idea to go there, and we need to be grounded better. And so, hopefully, well, we'll see how this works. All right, so how do I approach this? Well, first of all, I think in evolutionary terms, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the cosmos is 15 billion years old, and the world is 4.5 billion years old, and there's been life for 3.5 billion years, and there were creatures that had pretty developed nervous systems 300 to 600 million years ago, and we were living in trees as small mammals 60 million years ago, and we were down on the plains between 60 million and 7 million years ago, and that's about when we split from chimpanzees, and modern human beings seem to emerge about 150,000 years ago, and civilization pretty much after the last ice age, something after 15,000 years ago. Not very long ago at all, you know. And that's the span across which I want to understand That's the span across which I want to understand. I want to understand why we are the way we are, looking at life in its continual complexity, right from the beginning of life itself. And there's some real utility in that because we share attributes with other animals, even animals as simple as crustaceans, for example, have nervous system properties that are very much like ours, and it's very much worth knowing that. And so I think in an evolutionary way, I think it's a grand and remarkable way to think because it has this incredible time span, right? It's this amazing, I mean, people at the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, thought the world was about 6,000 years old. I mean, 15 billion years old, that's a lot more, right? It's a lot grander, it's a lot bigger, but it's also a lot more frightening and alienating in some sense because, you know, the cosmos has become so vast, it's either easy for human beings to think of themselves as trivial specks on a trivial speck out some misbegotten hellhole end of the galaxy among hundreds of millions of galaxies, right? It's very easy to see yourself as nothing in that span of time, and that's a real challenge for people, and I think it's a mistake to think that way. Because I think consciousness is far more than we think it is, but it's still something we have to grapple with. I'm a psychoanalytic thinker, and what that means is that I believe that people are collections of subpersonalities and that those subpersonalities are alive. They're not machines, they have their viewpoint, they have their wants, they have their perceptions, they have their arguments, they have their emotions. They're like low-resolution representations of you. You know, when you get angry, it's a very low-resolution representation of you. It only wants rage, or it only wants something to eat, or it only wants water, it only wants sex. It's you, but shrunk and focused in a specific direction. And all those motivational systems are very, very ancient, very archaic, and very, very powerful. And they play a determining role in the manner in which we manifest ourselves. And as Freud pointed out with the id, we have to figure out how to take all those underlying animalistic motivations and emotions and civilize them in some way so that we can all live in the same general territory without tearing each other to shreds, which is maybe the default position of both chimpanzee and humanity. You know, so I take that seriously, the idea that we're a loose collection of spirits, and that you know, it says in the Old Testament somewhere that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and I think this is akin to that. If you know that you're not in control of yourself thoroughly, and that there are other factors behind the scenes, like the Greeks thought that human beings were the playthings of the gods. That's the way they conceptualized the world. And they sort of meant the same thing. They meant that there are these great forces that move us, that we don't create, that we're subordinate to in some sense. Not entirely, but we can be subordinate to them, and they move our destinies. That was the Greek view, and there's something, it teaches you humility to understand that there's a hell of a lot more going on behind the scenes, and you're the driver of a very complex vehicle, but you don't understand the vehicle very well, and it's got its own motivations and methods, and sometimes you think it's doing something, and it's doing something completely different. You see that in psychotherapy all the time because, you know, you help someone unwind a pattern of behavior that they've manifested forever. First of all, they describe it, then they become aware of it, then maybe they start to see what the cause is. They had no idea why they were acting like that. You know, they have to have the memory that produced the behavioral pattern to begin with. It has to be brought back to mind, and then it has to be analyzed and assessed, and then they have to think about a different way of acting, and it's extraordinarily complex. So, psychoanalytic, literary. Well, there's this postmodern idea about literature, and about the world for that matter, that if you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play. The way you interpret it depends on how many other books you've read, depends on your orientation in the world. It depends on a very, very large number of things, how cultured you are or how much culture you lack, all of those things. It opens up a huge vista for potential interpretation. And so the postmodernists sort of stubbed their toe on that and thought, well, If there's this vast number of interpretations of any particular literary work, how can you be sure that any interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation? And if you can't be sure, then how do you even know those are great works? How do you know they can't, maybe they're just works that the people in power have used to facilitate their continual accession of power, which is really a postmodern idea, and a very, very cynical one, but it has its point. But the thing is, it's grounded in something real, right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. I want to show you something here, just briefly. We'll go back to it later. Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So, at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse, okay? Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book, right? I'm dead serious about that. You can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book, and it's because, well, the people who worked on these stories that are hypothetically at the end, right, which is, the end can't affect the beginning. That's the rule of time, right? What happens now can't affect what happened to you 10 years ago, even though it actually can, but whatever. Well, you reinterpret things, right, and then they're not the same, but whatever, we won't get into that. But technically speaking, the present cannot affect the past, but if we're looking at a piece of literature, that's not right, because when you write the end, you know what was at the beginning, and when you write the beginning, or edit it, you know what's at the end. And so you can weave the whole thing together. And there's 65,000 cross-references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never, ever get to the end of it. There's permutations and combinations, and every phrase is dependent on every other phrase, and every verse is dependent on every other, not entirely, but 65,000 is not a bad start. And so, okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up, and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures, because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know, because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person, and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person, and why not lie? mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question, because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good, because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends, and everyone dies, and it's painful. It's like, without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim. And it's not something, it's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, so look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality, because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow, and not next week, and not next month, and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. He says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy. That's so ridiculously comical, But you see, we have to grapple with that. And so the you that's out there in the future is sort of like another person. And so figuring out how to conduct yourself properly in relationship to your future self isn't much different than figuring out how to conduct yourself in relationship to other people. But then we could expand the constraints. Not only does the interpretation that you extract have to protect you from suffering and give you an aim, but it has to do it in a way that's iterable, so it works across time, and then it has to work in the presence of other people so that you can cooperate with them and compete with them in a way that doesn't make you suffer more. And people they're not that tolerant. They have choices. They don't have to hang around with you. They can hang around with any one of these other primates. And so if you don't act properly, at least within certain boundaries, it's like you're just cast aside. And so people are broadcasting information at you all the time about how you need to interpret the world so they can tolerate being around you. And you need that, because socially isolated, you're insane and then you're dead. No one can tolerate being alone for any length of time. We can't maintain our own sanity without continual feedback from other people because it's too damn complicated. So you're constrained by your own existence, and then you're constrained by the existence of other people. And then you're also constrained by the world. You know, if I read Hamlet and what I extract out of that is the idea that I should jump off a bridge, it's like it puts my interpretation to an end rather quickly. It doesn't seem to be optimally functional, let's say. And so an interpretation is constrained by the reality of the world, it's constrained by the reality of other people, and it's constrained by your reality across time. And there's only a small number of interpretations that are going to work in that tightly defined space. And so that's part of the reason that the postmodernists are wrong. It's also part of the reason, by the way, that AI people who've been trying to make intelligent machines have had to put them in a body. Is it turns out that you just can't make something intelligent in some sense without it being embodied. And it's partly for the reasons that I just described, is you need constraints on the system so that the system doesn't drown in an infinite sea of interpretation. It's something like that. So that's the literary end of it. Moral. Well, morality for me is about action. And I'm an existentialist in some sense. And what that means is that I believe that what people believe to be true is what they act out, not what they say. And so there's lots of definitions of truth. I mean, truth is a very expansive word, and you can think of objective truth. But behavioral truth isn't the same as objective truth. What you should do isn't the same as what is. As far as I can tell, people debate that. But I think the reason that that has to be the case is because, think about it this way. You're standing in front of a field, and you can see the field. But the field doesn't tell you how to walk through it. There's an infinite number of ways you could walk through it. And so you can't extract out an inviolable guide to how you should act from the array of facts that are in front of you. Because there's just too many facts. And they don't have directionality. But you need to know. You need to know how not to suffer. And you need to know what your aim is. And so you have to overlay that objective reality with some interpretive structure. And it's the nature of that interpretive structure that we're going to be aiming at hard. I've given you some hints about it already. We've extracted it in part from observations of our own behavior and other people's behavior. And we've extracted it in part by the nature of our embodiment that's been shaped over hundreds of millions of years. But we see the infinite plane of facts and we impose a moral interpretation on it. And the moral interpretation is what to do about what is. And that's associated both with security, because you just don't need too much complexity, and also with aim. And so we're mobile creatures, right? We need to know where we're going, because all we're ever concerned about, roughly speaking, is where we're going. That's what we need to know. Where are we going? What are we doing? And why? And that's not the same question as what is the world made of objectively. It's a different question. It requires different answers. And so that's the domain of the moral as far as I'm concerned, which is, well, what are you aiming at? And that's the question of the ultimate ideal in some sense. Even if you have trivial little, fragmentary ideals, there's something trying to emerge out of that that's more coherent and more integrated and more applicable and more practical. And that's the other thing, is that, you think about literature and you think about art and you think those aren't very tightly tied to the earth. They're Empyrean and airy and spiritual, and they don't seem practical, but I'm a practical person. And part of the reason that I want to assess these books from a literary and aesthetic and evolutionary perspective is to extract out something of value, something of real value that's practical. Something, because one of the rules that I have when I'm lecturing is that I don't want to tell anybody anything that they can't use, because I think of knowledge as a tool. It's something to implement in the world. We're tool-using creatures, and our knowledge is tools. And we need tools to work in the world. We need tools to regulate our emotions and to make things better and to put an end to suffering to the degree that we can and to live with ourselves properly and to stand up properly. And you need the tools to do that. And so I don't want to do anything in this lecture series that isn't practical. I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately apply, not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction. Rational, well, it's got to make sense, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's, somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution. So, and then finally, it's phenomenological. Modern people, we think of reality as objective, and that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience, and this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real. And so they're interested in the structure of your subjective experience. And you say, well, you have subjective experience, and you have subjective experience, and so do you. And there's commonalities across all of those. Like, for example, you're likely to experience the same set of emotions. We've been able to identify canonical emotions and canonical motivations. And without that, we couldn't even communicate, because you wouldn't know what the other person was like. You'd have to explain infinitely. There's nothing you could take for granted, but you can. And phenomenology is the fact that in the center of my vision, my hands are very clear, and then out in the periphery, they disappear. And phenomenology is the way things smell and the way things taste and the fact that they matter. And so you could say in some sense that phenomenology is the study of what matters rather than matter. And it's a given from the phenomenological perspective that things have meaning. And even if you're a rationalist, say, and a cynic and a nihilist, and you say, well, nothing has any meaning, you still run into the problem of pain, because pain undercuts your arguments and has a meaning. So there's no escaping from the meaning. You can pretty much demolish all the positive parts of it, but trying to think your way out of the negative parts, man, good luck with that, because that just doesn't work. So phenomenology is, and the Bible stories, and I think this is true of fiction in general, is phenomenological. And it concentrates on trying to elucidate the nature of human experience, and that is not the same as the objective world. But it's also a form of truth, because it is truth that you have a field of experience and that it has qualities. The question is, what are the qualities? Now, ancient representations of reality were sort of a weird meld of observable phenomena, things that we would consider objective facts, and subjective truth, the projection of subjective truth. And I'll show you, for example, I'll show you how the Mesopotamians viewed the world. They had a model. Basically, the world was a disc. If you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously, it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from? Well, there's water around the dome. And then there's land, that's the disc, and then underneath that there's water. How do you know that? Well, drill. You'll hit water. Well, it's under the earth, obviously, because otherwise how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? There's fresh water. And then what's under that? Well, if you go to the edge of the disc, you hit the ocean. It's salt water. So it's a dome with water outside of it. And then it's a disc that the dome sits on. And then underneath that, there's fresh water. And then underneath that, there's salt water. And that was roughly the Mesopotamian world. And you see that's a mix of observation and imagination, right? Because that isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. It's a perfectly believable cosmology and the sun rises and the sun sets on that dome. It's not like the thing is bloody well spinning. Who would ever think that up? It's obviously the sun comes up and goes down and then travels underneath the world and comes back up again. There's nothing more self-evident than that. Well, that's that strange intermingling of subjective fantasy, let's say, right at the level of perception and actual observable phenomena. And a lot of the cosmology that's associated with the biblical stories is exactly like that. It's half psychology and half reality, although the psychological is real as well. So that, and to know that the biblical stories have a phenomenological truth is really worth knowing, because, you know, the poor fundamentalists, they're trying to cling to their moral structure, and, you know, I understand why, because it does organize their societies and it organizes their psyche, so they've got something to cling to, but, you know, they don't have a very sophisticated idea of the complexity of what constitutes truth, and they try to gerrymander the biblical stories into the domain of scientific theory, you know, promoting creationism, for example, as an alternative scientific theory. It's like that just isn't going to go anywhere, you know, because the people who wrote these damn stories weren't scientists to begin with. There weren't any scientists back then. There's hardly any scientists now. You know, it's hard to think scientifically, man. It's like, it takes a lot of training, and even scientists don't think scientifically once you get them out of the lab, and hardly even when they're in the lab. You know, you got to get peer-reviewed and criticized, and like, it's hard to think scientifically. So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought, but that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth. And that's okay, you know. There are truths to live by. Okay, well, fine. Then we want to figure out what those are, because we need to live and maybe not to suffer so much. So if you know that what the Bible stories and stories in general are trying to represent is the lived experience of conscious individuals, like the structure of the lived experience of conscious individuals, then that opens up the possibility of a whole different realm of understanding.